Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Jared, and today we are going to be talking about the 1995 film Pocahontas, which is the 33rd theatrically released Disney animated film directed by Mike Gabriel and Eric Goldberg. This is a huge film that follows the story of Pocahontas and John Smith and their fabled meeting in the New World. This is a film that I'm excited to talk about because it is the first ever misfire in the Disney Renaissance, and many people have talked about this film and have dug into why exactly it doesn't work, but I want to at least give my 2 cents about the movie because there are things that I do think do work, but for the most part, it is a movie that kind of ends up falling apart by the seams, and you can see that in many of the different areas because nothing in this movie, I feel, is particularly bad, but it just leads to a film that ends up feeling very lackluster and mediocre by the end. It's an ambitious project that also feels a bit stale when you really look at it. And if you want to know anything about Pocahontas, this is the brainchild of Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey Katzenberg, during the Disney Renaissance, spearheaded this movement of just amazing animation, and he wasn't alone in this. You had others such as Michael Eisner working on this to really create something truly special. And for the first couple of movies during the Disney Renaissance, that truly was it. Not only were these movies box office successes, which Disney was sorely lacking during the transitional era, but critical acclaim, and Beauty and the Beast even becoming a Oscar-nominated Best Picture nominee, which is so cool. And that is what Jeffrey Katzenberg wanted Pocahontas to be. He spearheaded this project to basically be another Beauty and the Beast. He wanted an Oscar contender. He wanted all the nominations for Academy Awards. And I think that mentality is what doomed Pocahontas from the start. Because not only is it a little bit of a flimsy idea when you really dig down deep about it, but everything that they worked towards with this film, with the processing of the animation itself, just kind of spreading themselves thin throughout the production, led, I think, to one of the most mediocre Disney films that they have ever made. Pocahontas is a beautiful looking film, but it lacks a real heart and soul to it that made the other Disney films during the Renaissance so special. And you see the chink in the Disney armor right here. This project was so big at this point that people actually left The Lion King to work on this film. As you know from my Lion King review, Pocahontas was going to be their next big film, and Lion King was almost this little B project that they thought would probably be fine, but Pocahontas was their main focus. And so it's so interesting knowing that so much work went into a pretty lackluster film overall. Now, that doesn't mean that Pocahontas isn't without its great moments. The animation, when you truly look at it, is beautiful. I love the colors in this movie, the use of lighting, all the different techniques that they had honed in through the years, kind of just being a very Marvel-looking animated film. Everything looks very good and clean and crisp, and that's how I like my animated films. When it comes to the writing, there's just a whole lack of depth and character and humanity in these characters. You don't feel emotionally connected to them for the most part. They feel very bland, and that starts from the very beginning of the film. I feel as if all of the Disney films up to this point have this huge bombastic, wonderful hook at the beginning of the film that really got you into the story. Instead, we have this sort of sea shanty that everybody sings as they are packing up to leave England to visit the New World. And we get introduced to some of our major characters, especially John Smith, as they enter into the New World. And there's an aura of mystery at the core of it, but it just doesn't really land. There's nothing emotional about this moment. It's just kind of standard. And I feel like that is what this movie mostly does. It kind of follows the beats of a traditional story because that is how a traditional story goes, and doesn't really add much more to it. There's no life in the movie. In fact, I would almost compare this movie to one of the most recent Disney animated films, Wish, a very ambitious movie that wanted to celebrate Disney and ultimately faltered under the weight of its own ambitions and own ideas. And it was a very corporate kind of film that was kind of mishmashed to celebrate Disney without truly understanding the core and love that is in a Disney picture. So I think ultimately Pocahontas is ambitious, but it's not very cinematic. And that even goes down to the music, which is done this time by Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz of Wicked fame. And these two are really good together, and I think that the music, for the most part, is perfectly fine. However, it doesn't have the magic or the wonder of the work that Menken would end up doing with Howard Ashman or even Tim Rice. However, what is here is competently done. It is a nice soundtrack, but there's just not a whole lot of memorable themes, aside for things such as Just Around the River Bend, Savages, and of course Colors of the Wind, which are all really good songs, and it's understandable why Colors of the Wind is kind of the one thing that makes this movie special, because that song was Oscar nominated. It was a really good song, and it's the thing that people remember the most from this, besides some of the problems with the historical inaccuracies of the film. But one thing that I do think, for the most part, works is Pocahontas herself. I think the performance is very good, and it kind of sets the benchmark for what Disney animated princesses and characters overall would eventually accomplish in films like Frozen, Tangled, and Moana especially. However, I do find Pocahontas herself rather bland, and most of the characters overall. There's just not a lot of characterization with these people to really care. And one of the things I was noticing while watching the movie was how little time it feels like passes throughout this movie. There's no sense of a timeline of events. Everything feels as if it is taking place in one singular day. John Smith and Pocahontas' relationship just kind of blossoms very quickly. They're in love, and then the movie starts to end. And that is just very bizarre to me. I feel like there should have been a little bit more going on here, because it does feel so empty, and it feels almost like they ran out of time, which I know is probably not the case, despite the fact that they were really pushing with this movie with delays and problems with the animation processing. But overall, that is one of the big problems of the movie. Now, I do want to dig into something else. Many people point to this movie at its historical inaccuracies, and there are a ton, obviously. We know for a fact that Pocahontas and John Smith didn't really have so much of a romantic relationship. She was a lot younger. There's a lot of problematic things along the way, embellishing of John Smith's own story. And I do want to kind of defend this. Disney has looked at fairy tales its entire existence and has morphed and changed these immortal fables and fairy tales into stories that are digestible for not only adults but children. They're easy to understand, and sometimes they do change things around and change the theming from the much more darker elements of the original stories. And they kind of do that with Pocahontas as well. Pocahontas is a story that we know as a people. It is the instance where we see Western culture meet with the Native Americans of North America, and we see that clashing of cultures. It's a very important moment in our history, despite the bloody violence that would partake in this moment in history. However, it is a moment that has been immortalized through fables and fairy tales, and it is a story worthy of being told in animation. However, was that the right choice? Well, after watching something like The New World, which I think kind of does what Pocahontas was trying to do, I think that the honest choice was to go with live action, ultimately to tell this story in a similar kind of way. However, what is here is perfectly fine. It does have some problematic moments throughout, and it is very much fancifying a historical event. But can we really condemn the movie just solely for that? Because I think, besides the historical inaccuracies, the movie has a whole lot more problems with characterizations, as I said, and just feeling overall lifeless and bland. When the movie ends, I don't really feel a sense of wonder or feeling connected to any one of these characters. They just feel rather flat, and I feel like, well, you know what? I just spent some time with these characters and that was it. Did I enjoy myself for a few moments? Yeah, but for the most part, this is ultimately going to be a forgettable experience. And that is one of Pocahontas's biggest sins, is it's forgettable at the end of the day. You look at all of the Disney movies so far during the Disney Renaissance, even the movies that I didn't particularly love, such as Rescuers Down Under, there is wonder in that film and wonder in all of the previous films that makes you care about the characters, gets you wrapped up in the world and story, and it just ultimately isn't here at the very end. Pocahontas is a rather bland film. It's a movie that I desperately want to like. There are things when I watch it where I'm like, these are good things. The songs are good, the animation is beautiful, and the ideas are there. But it ultimately feels like Oscar bait by the end of the film and just falls flat for me. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Pocahontas a 5 out of 10. I really was hoping that with this recent rewatch that I would give it at least a little higher of a grade, but I watch this movie and I forget about it, and it's just rather disappointing, especially with all of the Disney animated films that came before this during the Renaissance and the ones that would come after. And this is the point in the Disney Renaissance that I would probably say is the start of the low Renaissance. You had the high Renaissance with these big budget animated films that were critically acclaimed and box office successes, and then you slowly start to see that kind of dwindle towards the end of the Renaissance. Though we will be getting into those films in the future, and there are some great ones there that, of course, are critically acclaimed and box office successes. But Pocahontas just really isn't one of the greats in not only the Disney Renaissance, but the Disney canon overall. But that is all I got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed this review, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.